The galaxy was not ruled by kings or generals, but by fear. Entire empires had learned to step back when the women of the Vishar species entered a hall. They were tall, graceful, with skin like living metal, eyes burning with strange fire, and a presence that made even their own warriors keep distance. Among their kind, women were not queens of beauty, but queens of danger. They carried something inside them, a power that could tear through walls, crush bones, and shatter ships. It was said no one touched them without risking death, and no man of any world dared stand close. When the first war broke out between humans and the Vishar, the galaxy whispered that humanity would fall within weeks. The men of the Vishar were cruel fighters, but it was their women that turned the tide. They did not need ships. They did not need blades. Their very nearness was enough to terrify entire armies. Across battlefields, human soldiers saw armored lines break the moment one Vishar woman stepped forward, and whispers spread like wildfire. Entire colonies retreated before a single figure cloaked in silver flame. But there was one moment that the galaxy never expected. On the battlefield of Zoran V, when ash rained from the skies and human soldiers lay wounded in the ruins of broken tanks, a Vishar woman appeared. She was taller than any human there, her silver skin glistening with energy, her steps shaking the ground. Even her own people watching from the ridge fell back. None dared come close. Her kind feared their own power, feared losing control. To them, distance was survival. To the galaxy, she was terror in the shape of a woman. The humans froze, every soldier holding his breath. No one fired, no one moved. Fear was stronger than courage, and the legend of these women kept even the bravest men silent. Yet from the smoke, one figure began to walk forward. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes were calm. He carried no weapon raised, only his step steady against the cracking ground. A human soldier, smaller than her, weaker by any measure, dared to walk straight toward the being that whole armies avoided. The soldiers behind him whispered in panic. Some shouted for him to stop. Others closed their eyes, waiting for the sound of his body breaking under invisible power. The Vishar woman tilted her head, her burning eyes narrowing in disbelief. No one had ever done this before. Not her enemies, not her allies, not even the men of her own species. The human did not slow. Dust clung to his boots as he moved closer, the ground trembling with her energy. He looked up at her without flinching, as if her presence was no more than wind. For a moment, silence covered the battlefield. The woman's power rippled like heat, bending the air, making steel groan. The men of her kind who had watched from the ridge muttered in fear, certain that the human would be torn apart. Yet the strange thing was this: his body did not fall. His steps did not falter. Whatever force swirled around her, it did not crush him. She felt the energy pushing outward, but when it touched him, it broke like water against stone. His presence was not resistance, but something else. Something she could not name. The woman's lips parted, though no words came at first. For centuries, her kind had lived apart, untouchable even by their own blood. To reach for another meant madness or death. Yet this human walked closer and closer until he stood at her feet, looking up with steady eyes. The galaxy had built her into a monster of fear, and here stood a man who saw something else. A sound spread through the ranks of human soldiers. It was not a cry of despair, but a roar of disbelief. They saw with their own eyes what none would ever believe if told. A human stood before the most feared being in the galaxy, and she had not struck him down. She stared at him as if the impossible had walked into her path. For the first time in her life, the woman did not know whether she was the danger or if he was. The soldiers of both sides stood frozen. The wind carried ash, the ruins crackled with fire, and still the human and the Vishar woman faced each other in silence. Around them, men who had fought moments before now dared not even breathe. Every eye was fixed on this impossible scene. For centuries, no one had dared come this close to one of the feared women, and yet here he was, steady and calm. As if death had no claim over him, the woman's power rippled, testing him. Her people called it the storm, a force that lived in the hearts of their women, untamed and dangerous. It made walls melt, air bend, and flesh crumble. But when the storm brushed against the human skin, it slid away, refusing to take hold. She felt it herself, the rejection, as if some barrier around him turned her own strength aside. Her burning eyes narrowed, not in anger but in disbelief. He should have been broken. He should have been gone. Instead, he stood before her, unshaken. The human raised his head and spoke, his voice low but clear. "You don't scare me." Gasps spread through the lines. The Vishar men on the ridge looked at one another in shock. Their women were treated as sacred and untouchable, both feared and obeyed. For a man to speak such words was unthinkable. To them, it was blasphemy, yet the woman herself did not strike him down. She studied him, her face still, her fire flickering like a storm caught in glass. The human's comrades muttered behind him. Some shouted, begging him to retreat before it was too late, but he did not listen. He had seen enough war, enough running. His people had bled and broken under this fear, and someone had to stand. He thought of the friends lost, of the villages burned, of the endless whisper that said humans were weak, fragile, and doomed. He refused to carry that lie any longer. If fear ruled this galaxy, then it would not rule him. The Vishar woman spoke at last, her voice deep and ringing like metal struck by lightning. "You should be ashes." Her words cut through the battlefield like a blade, but the human only met her eyes. "And yet I'm not." Her lips pressed into a line. She felt the truth of his words. The storm inside her pushed harder, but still it slid off him. He was not immune. She could feel the edge of his strength bending, but he endured. And more than that, he looked at her not as a monster, not as a goddess, but as another being. That was what shook her most of all. For all her life, she had been treated as danger given shape. Even her own kind stepped back, bowed or fled. But this human stood, not in worship, not in terror, but in simple defiance. The men of her species growled from the ridge. Some raised weapons, ready to strike the human for his boldness. Yet none dared move closer to her. She raised a hand, and her storm flickered outward, forcing them back without a word. Their obedience was not loyalty but fear. She looked again at the human, and for the first time in centuries, she felt something new rising inside her, a question. Why him? Why? Could he stand? The human took another step forward, closing the last of the space between them. He stood so near that the heat of her storm should have burned the flesh from his bones. Instead, his skin glistened with sweat, but he did not fall. He looked up at her towering figure and said, "If you want to destroy us, you'll have to start with me." Her burning eyes widened. The words were not threat, not plea, but promise. Around them, silence deepened. For the first time, the woman of Vishar did not feel like the one in control. This human, small in size and fragile in flesh, carried something her storm could not break. She leaned closer, her voice dropping lower. "Why do you not fear me?" he answered without pause. "Because you are not fear. You're just someone no one dared to face." The ground shook beneath them as her storm flared, and yet her hand trembled at her side. She had been the terror of the galaxy, untouchable and unchallenged. But now, as she stared into the eyes of one man, she realized the galaxy's fear might have been wrong all along. The battlefield remained silent. Both armies, human and Vishar, watched without moving. Smoke curled upward, carrying the smell of burning metal and scorched ground, but no one dared disturb the scene. One human stood before the feared woman, and she had not destroyed him. For the galaxy, This moment felt like the earth itself had cracked open. The Vishar woman's eyes burned brighter, her silver skin glowing faintly as the storm inside her surged. The power long feared by every soldier, the power that could melt tanks and crush stone, flared around her. Yet it still refused to consume him. It lashed at the air, bending light, making sparks scatter, but against him it broke again and again. She lowered her hand, unsettled by her own failure. Never before had her strength failed to bring death. The human's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. He was not untouched. Sweat rolled down his skin, his knees trembled, and he could feel the pressure crushing against him like the weight of a collapsing mountain. But he refused to step back. He had seen fear take too much already. If he broke now, if he fell like the others, then nothing would change. So he locked his legs, clenched his fists, and stood. The Vishar men watching from the ridge shouted in disbelief. Their words carried across the battlefield, harsh and angry, demanding she finish the human, demanding she protect the pride of their people. But their shouts rang hollow, for none of them dared step down. They knew what her storm could do, and they wanted no part of it. They wanted her to destroy him, yet secretly they feared she might not be able to. Her burning eyes never left him. Slowly she spoke again, her voice low. "You should not exist in my presence." "And yet," he said, steady though his body shook, "I do." She stared at him for a long moment. Something stirred inside her, something she had buried long ago. Her kind was raised to believe they were danger itself, cursed to walk alone, never touched, never close, never safe. Their power had made them weapons, not women. But this human looked at her without fear, without worship, without the careful steps of her own kind. He looked at her like someone who refused to accept the lie of untouchable monsters. For the first time, she wondered if that lie had chained her as much as it had chained others. The human's voice carried again. "You're not fear. You're not death. You're someone who's been forced to believe that's all you are." Her breath caught, though she did not show it. No one had ever spoken to her like this. Even her own father had never come this close. Every relationship she had known was built on distance, on worship, or on terror. Yet this man dared to treat her as equal, not legend. His words felt dangerous, more dangerous than any weapon. Because they struck not her body but her heart. Around them, the human soldiers slowly began to stand taller. They saw one of their own refuse to bow, and courage rose in them like fire. Whispers spread. If he could stand, perhaps they could too. Fear cracked, just slightly, but enough to shift the balance of the battlefield. The Vishar soldiers saw it too, unease spreading through their ranks. They had relied on fear to break enemies before fighting. Now that fear was shaken, the woman felt it as well. The storm inside her burned hotter, not in rage but in confusion. Her whole life, she had been taught to keep distance, to rule by fear. Yet here was proof that fear could be resisted. She looked at the human, searching for weakness, but found only resolve. She raised her hand again, storm energy flickering like fire across her silver skin. Soldiers braced for the strike that would finally tear him apart. But the strike did not come. Her hand trembled. The storm surged but faltered, as if refusing to obey. The human's eyes met hers again, steady, unbroken. Something shifted between them, something that no soldier on that battlefield could name. In that moment, the galaxy's most feared woman realized she was no longer certain who held the power. The wind howled over the ruins, carrying sparks from burning wreckage. Human soldiers stood frozen, staring at the sight that made no sense. Their comrade remained standing before the feared woman, alive when he should have been nothing but ash. The Vishar soldiers on the ridge shouted louder, their voices filled with panic and anger, but still none dared to step forward. They were warriors bred for war, yet even they feared their own women more than they hated their enemy. The human soldier's heart pounded in his chest. but he forced his breath steady. Every step he had taken toward her had been a choice against fear. Now he stood only an arm's length away, the heat of her storm scorching the air, his body trembling under invisible pressure, yet his eyes never broke away from hers. He had decided that no matter the pain, no matter the risk, he would not retreat. The Vishar woman tilted her head, her fiery eyes locked onto him. Her kind had been feared across star systems, worshipped as weapons, but she saw something in this man that unsettled her more than any army. His body was weak compared to hers, fragile compared to her storm, yet his will refused to bend. For the first time in her life, she felt doubt not of her strength, but of its meaning. She lowered her hand slowly, her storm still burning but no longer lashing outward. The soldiers behind her gasped in disbelief. To lower her hand before an enemy was unthinkable. Her men shouted, demanding she finish him, demanding she uphold the terror of her people. She ignored them. Her gaze remained on the human, as if searching his face for an answer to a question she had never asked before. The human spoke again, his voice steady despite the strain on his body. "We've been told to fear you, to run, to surrender before. We fight, but I see something else. You're not death. You're alive. And maybe you're just as trapped by fear as we are." Her breath hitched, though she gave no sign of it. His words cut deep, not because they were weapons, but because they were true. She remembered her childhood, the way even her mother had kept distance, the way her people had whispered that their women were too dangerous for touch. She remembered standing alone, worshipped but never held, obeyed but never loved. Her storm had given her power but stolen her life. The Vishar men shouted again, this time raising their weapons toward the human. Their pride demanded blood. But before they could move, the woman released a wave of energy that crashed outward, forcing them back. They fell to their knees, shielding themselves from her storm. Her voice rang across the field, cold and sharp. "No one touches him." Gasps echoed through both armies. Human soldiers looked at one another in disbelief, their fear breaking into confusion. Vishar soldiers trembled, stunned by the order. For one of their women to protect an enemy was beyond understanding. Yet the truth stood before their eyes. She had chosen not to destroy him. The human's chest rose with heavy breaths. He did not move, did not break the fragile connection between them. His comrades behind him whispered in awe. For the first time, the tide of war shifted, not by weapons but by a single act of defiance. The woman stepped closer, towering over him, her storm swirling like fire barely contained. She looked down at him, her voice softer now, though it still carried power. "Why do you not fall? Why do you not fear me?" He looked up, sweat dripping from his brow, and answered simply, "Because someone had to stand, and I chose to." Her eyes burned brighter, but not with anger. It was something else, something she had no word for. In that moment, she saw him not as fragile, not as prey, but as equal. Perhaps even more. Around them, the galaxy held its breath, waiting for the storm to break, and yet she did not strike. The battlefield that had once echoed with gunfire now carried only silence. Soldiers from both sides watched in disbelief as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. A single human stood unbroken in front of the galaxy's most feared woman. And she had lowered her hand instead of striking him down. The Vishar soldiers shifted uneasily, their weapons trembling in their hands. For generations, their faith in victory had rested on the terror their women inspired. But if even one human could resist that terror, then the foundation of their power cracked. Murmurs spread like fire, some demanding the woman prove her strength, others whispering that perhaps the human had some hidden protection. The human soldier felt the weight of every eye on him. His body screamed in pain under the pressure of her storm, but he stood tall. He did not show weakness, because weakness would give fear back to the galaxy. He had not come here to fight her with bullets or blades. He had come to show something greater, that humans could stand where no one else dared. The woman's silver skin glowed faintly in the smoke-filled air. Her storm swirled around her like fire chained to her body, restrained but restless. She should have ended him long ago. She could have torn through his fragile body with a thought. Yet something inside her rebelled against that idea. For the first time in her life, she felt her storm bend to doubt. She looked at him and saw not prey, but defiance that even she could not break. Her men called out again, furious and afraid. "Destroy him! End this weakness!" But she turned her fiery eyes on them, and they fell silent under her gaze. She was their greatest fear too, and none of them dared disobey. She had been raised to embody terror, but at this moment, she was protecting the very enemy they wanted crushed. The contradiction burned through their ranks like poison. The human took a slow breath and spoke again. "You're not our end. You're not their end either. You've been used as a weapon, feared even by your own kind. But look around you. Everyone obeys fear, not truth. And fear can't rule forever." The words pierced deeper than any blade. She thought of her life among the Vishar, how no man dared touch her hand, how even her own sisters kept distance. She thought of nights spent alone, hearing whispers that they were cursed by their storm, doomed to walk without closeness. And now here stood a human, fragile yet unyielding, speaking truths no one in her own empire had ever dared. Her storm flared, but this time it was not in rage. It was confusion, conflict, a storm that turned inward instead of outward. She stepped closer, her towering figure casting a shadow over him, but her voice was softer. "Why do you fight for a people who cannot win?" He looked up at her with steady eyes. "Because we don't fight to win. We fight because no one else will. If we stand, maybe others will too. Maybe even you." The words struck her like a hammer. She felt her chest tighten, though her body betrayed no weakness. Was he offering her something no one else had choice? For centuries, her kind had been trapped by their own storm, bound by fear they inspired. But now she wondered if she had the power not to destroy, but to decide. The soldiers on both sides could feel it. The ground itself seemed to hum with tension. The balance of war no longer rested on weapons, but on the silent exchange between one human and one Vishar woman. The human's comrades, still crouched behind rubble, began to rise. Courage spread through them, not because the battle was won, but because they saw that fear could be broken. Their whispers grew into shouts, their shouts into a roar. They no longer hid from her presence. They stood. The Vishar soldiers gripped their weapons, shaken by the shift. For the first time, their fear of their own women was mirrored by fear of losing the fear itself. If their storm could not break humans, then what was left of their dominance? The woman felt it all, the voices, the fear, the hope. She looked down at the human, her storm flickering wildly, and realized she stood at a choice her people had never faced. She could end him now and restore the terror of her kind. Or she could step into the unknown and let the galaxy see something it had never believed possible. The battlefield was no longer a place of war. It had become an arena of silence, every soldier watching, every weapon lowered, waiting for what the Vishar woman would do. The galaxy's fear rested in her hands, but for the first time, she hesitated. The storm that burned around her crackled louder, sparks flying into the air, scorching the ground at her feet. Yet its fury no longer felt like power. It felt like a cage, one she had carried her whole life. Her eyes, burning like molten fire, locked onto the human who stood before her. His body trembled, sweat soaked his torn uniform, but his stance never broke. He had no shield, no weapon raised, and still he faced her as if she was not a monster, but a choice. The human spoke again, his voice clear across the broken land. "You can end me right here. You can make the galaxy keep fearing you. But if you do, nothing changes. Fear wins again. Or you can choose something else. The words struck deeper than any weapon. No one had ever told her she had a choice. From the moment of her birth, her storm had been her prison. Her own people feared. Her enemies fled before her. Even her own sisters kept their distance, bowing but never touching. She was power, but she had never been free. Her men shouted again, desperate to see their terror restored. "Destroy him! Do it!" Their voices cracked, less commanding now and more pleading. They needed her to keep the fear alive, because without it, they were nothing. She turned her head slowly toward them, her fiery eyes narrowing, and in that moment, she understood. They did not serve her out of loyalty. They served because they were afraid. Fear had built her throne, but fear had also chained her. She was not their queen. She was their prison guard, and she hated it. She turned back to the human. He met her gaze with calm defiance, and for the first time, she felt the storm inside. Her quiet, not gone, not broken, but calmed, as if his presence tamed what no one else ever could. Her hand lowered fully, the storm shrinking back into her skin. Gasps rippled across both armies. The feared woman of the Vishar had disarmed herself in front of an enemy. It was an act no one could explain, a moment that shattered every law of her people. The human let out a breath he had been holding, but did not step back. He remained close, his eyes steady, his voice quiet but strong. "You're more than what they made you." She studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice softer than thunder but still carrying across the field, she spoke. "Perhaps so." The Vishar soldiers erupted in confusion, shouting over one another. Some demanded she kill him, others began to retreat, shaken by the breaking of their greatest weapon. The human soldiers, however, began to cheer. They saw not just survival, but victory, the kind that could not be measured in battles won, but in fear defeated. The woman raised her hand once more, and both armies froze. Her storm flickered, but not in rage. She turned to her own men, her voice hard as steel. "No more," her words echoed, sharp and final. The Vishar soldiers hesitated, then slowly lowered their weapons. They obeyed, not out of fear this time, but out of shock. Their greatest terror had chosen not to strike. The human soldier stood taller, his comrades roaring with newfound courage. He had not won with guns or blades, but with the simple act of standing where no one else dared. And in doing so, he had broken the galaxy's oldest fear. The woman looked at him one last time, her burning eyes softer now, almost curious. "Human," she said, her voice carrying a weight of centuries, "you are not like the rest." He allowed himself the smallest smile. "Neither are you." The battlefield that had been drenched in war now carried something new: hope. Two armies stood in uneasy silence, no longer certain what tomorrow would bring. But they all knew one truth. The day a human walked up to the most feared woman in the galaxy, and she chose not to destroy him, was the day everything changed.